Welcome to the third and final part of my series on the Reti Gambit against the French defense. We will be following the game between Levan Aronian and Loke van Wely in the Amber Blindfold tournament in 2006. 3-4 e6, b3, d5, bishop b2, c5 is the defense we will be dealing with in this video. By the way, our game actually started with e4 c5, b3 e6. Though usually in the Sicilian with b3, black usually prefers to play e5 and d6, blocking out the bishop and b2. But okay, in the game, e6, bishop b2, d5, and here White can play knight f3, bishop b5, or e takes d5 in different move orders, but the resulting middle games are very similar, so I'll keep it simple by just following this main game. If you like something less common, there is the rare queen e2, that also looks possible. Okay, e takes d5 was played by Aronian. After e takes, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, queen e2 check, queen e7. There's hardly any point in playing bishop e7 or knight e7 due to obvious reasons. After knight c3, now black could play knight f6, take, knight b5, and after king d8, white seems to be in charge, but it's not a very big advantage, but it's still a very uncomfortable advantage, I think. So, Van Wely chose to trade on e2, queens, and now instead of knight g takes, knight f6, d4, which looks like the obvious continuation, Aronian played bishop takes e2. One point is keeping the white fielders on, which means that bishop d7 may be a little obstructed by pawn d5. And then another point is that the knight can go to b5 now that the bishop has moved. And, in the game, black probably should have played knight f6 at this point, and after knight b5, you can choose between three small evils: moving the king, giving up the bishop pair, or putting the knight on the rim. In the game, he played d4 instead, shutting in bishop b2 and opening up for bishop d7, which sounds promising for black. But this may actually be the root of black's problems in the game, as we shall see. White played knight b5, threatening a fork, king d8, and now c3. We all know that one should open up the position if the opponent's king is caught in the center, and here black can't keep the d-file closed, as he would lose a pawn. So, a6, knight retreats, and d takes, and d takes. And white is already very comfortable here. And the arrows illustrate a very obvious plan for white, playing c4, opening up for bishop e2, knight c2 to e3, putting the bishop on f3, or speedy development with knight f3 instead, perhaps. But Aronian comes up with a probably even stronger plan. After knight c6, we played knight c4, threatening a fork. So, black defense, and now the point, bishop c1. He wants to keep pawn c3 where it is, to stifle black's main chance of counterplay, which is to jump in with a knight on b4 or d4. And so the pawn almost dominates the knight single-handedly here. After b5, Aronian checked on b5, on f4, king b7, and a 000. And thanks to some convenient in-between threats, White has kept his lead in development while putting every piece on its optimal square. Black defends the bishop, and the knight finally retreats. Bishop e7 and bishop f3. Surely the best square for the bishop. And both black knights find themselves dominated and in the way of the black, and they are also in the way of the black bishops. Followed rook h d8, knight e2, bishop e6, g4, taking space, rook takes, and all the rooks disappear, and g5, knight d7, and h4. White has converted his lead in development into a space advantage on the king side and better placed pieces. His bishops are really working well together, holding down black. Followed f6 and bishop e4, and now black has to play g6 and king d2, just moving the king into the center. F takes, h takes, and pawn h7 has become a fixed weakness. Black's king on b7 isn't very impressive either. Still, black tries to hang on with bishop c7, getting rid of at least one of the bishops. And I followed knight d5. And now it turned out that it was probably a slight mistake to exchange on f4 first. He probably should have taken on d5, even if it leaves in a worse ending with after bishop takes, and bishop takes f4, and knight takes f4. And white has the edge of a bishop over knight, and weak pawns on the king side to attack. But in the game, if the bishop takes f4 check, knight e takes, black crumbled after bishop f7, just a losing mistake. He had to go into the former ending with bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, and white may have gained half a move or something by getting his knight to d5 for free almost. But there is still a chance to survive for black here. In the game, after bishop f7, I followed knight e7 with a direct threat on knight c6, knight de5. Now white can take on c6 and play knight d3, which wins a pawn due to the threat of a fork on e5. Instead he played knight d3 at once, which is very similar, but black is probably forced to take on d3, which he didn't, and then, for example, white can take with the king, to bishop e8, and then knight g8, playing to win the pawn on h7 and enter a very comfortable ending with a good knight versus a bad bishop. In the game, black played king b6 to defend the pawn, and I followed knight takes c6. And after knight takes, white simply took on c6, and black resigned as he realize that he will lose his bishop on f7.